Say what you want about the Abattoir of Zir, but one thing that it has done to an exceptional degree is bring the entirety of every single system in the game Diablo 4 under an incredible amount of scrutiny, demanding of the players that they look into every nook and cranny for the benefits, the strengths, the trade-offs, the itemization changes, the Paragon optimizations that they could possibly need to be able to push all the way to tier 25, which has already been accomplished by the strongest possible build in the game. But for the other classes, most notably the Necromancer, we're still looking for ways to optimize to be able to push into the 20s as a potential maximum output of damage and survivability that the class has available to it. From itemization, a thing that we know is going to be completely overhauled in Season 4, to class balance, which almost certainly is going to be addressed as we transition into Season 3. But one system that this new content has brought the most interest into, or at least the most amount of time I've spent on it in trying to optimize, is in the Paragon System. And that's what drove me to start looking at some pretty wild stuff that you probably haven't looked at in a very long time. Do you remember the fact that there are magic glyphs in this game? Now, the magic glyphs are truly an artifact of a bygone era, and for people who haven't been playing the game since before release, basically the purpose of them is to give you an option for something to level or to slot into your Paragon board while leveling before you drop the rest of your rare glyphs. At this point, this deep into the season, maybe this is your first season and you never really paid attention to it, it turns out you need to drop the glyphs in the game. Every single rare glyph does not start in your character's inventory at the beginning of a season. Now, while the Pokemon game of collecting them all used to be a bit arduous and you actually couldn't demand to have every single glyph that you may need, depending at what progression point you were or how many hours you've put into the beginning of a season, even in the instances, the one use case where you hadn't found the rare glyph that you're looking for, so instead you slot in a magic glyph just to not lose out on any potential power within range of the glyph socket itself. Sadly, with how the Paragon system has evolved, how the damage has been stabilized or balanced, the magic glyphs currently do not serve any practical point in the game, even if you haven't found the exact glyph that you're looking for, like pre-season 2 overpower builds. You almost certainly had found one of the other glyphs that at least did something for your build or netted you some benefit. So I finished this tier 10 Abattoir of Zir run that we're winding down on, and I leveled up every one of these glyphs just to take a look at them, because I had never done that before. I had never spent glyph experience on them in any way. I didn't even really know what their maximum radius was, because you never need them. And sadly, my hopes for being able to slot in a Slayer glyph were quickly dashed to the ground. But let me go ahead and show you it and what I was thinking about at the time, hence the reason why I'm making this video at all. So it turns out the most dexterity that you can get within radius of any one of these glyphs is on the starter board or on Cult Leader of all places, where a total of 27 dexterity can net you a whopping 18.2 damage to elites. Now here's the funny part, that's actually not nothing. That's actually not a terrible amount of damage to elites, because again, with Blood Seekers, you're going to have permanent uptime on this, right? They are always going to be elites. You're always going to do this extra damage to elites. Now, why would you possibly ever want to use a glyph like this? Look at how few points it takes to be able to get the glyph to this point. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 total points on a board where you actually only need to travel 2 from a relevant node to be able to get to it and to empower it this far. Now, I hear what you're saying. That's still not good enough, and I completely agree. But let me just walk you through why I was thinking about this. While I was trying to optimize my Paragon boards, I kept noticing that I was running into issues with being able to actually hit the minimum requirements on 6 glyphs. A 6 glyph setup would ultimately give me enough damage, hopefully to be able to push past a tier 14 Abattoir of Zir, my current Infinimus build, without needing to hyper level up my Tears of Blood glyph, which I think right now is still only rank 12. And I was just on the cusp of being able to clear a tier 14. I was mostly running out of time before I could finish killing the Blood Seekers. So I started looking elsewhere. If I wasn't going to be able to hit the minimum requirements for a glyph, the reality is it was just going to give me a small amount of additive bonus. And damage to elites is just a really valuable stat in general. But here's the primary issue with these glyphs. There's just not enough stats within range. So if we were to look at all of the stats that are within radius at the 2 node radius, the beginning distance that these glyphs start at before they rank up and increase their radius, you'll notice that there is a whopping total of 25 intelligence within range on Scent of Death, And then everything else is 10, 15, 20, heck, even only 5 or 0 stats within range. On Sent to Death, there's literally no dexterity within range here. And that's the first problem with it. But the moment that we bump it up to a node radius of 3, like when you have it leveled up so it actually increases its radius, it gets a little bit better. There's 50 intelligence within range. So now all of a sudden, if we were to kind of build around or be using one of these intelligent nodes, we'll look at wisdom here as an example. Wisdom just gives you 1.5 damage all the way through, just per 5 intelligence within range. So that means that with 50, you'd get 10 of this. So you get a whopping 15 all damage. But it's like almost interesting enough. And again, when we use the example of overwhelmed, when we're looking at how much willpower can we get within range, you can actually get up to a whopping 32, which is going to net you close to about 57 overpower damage. And that's actually not terrible. Now, when we're talking about 57 overpower damage, if you have no other sources for it, that's like pretty decent for what you're going to get out of it. So what could they possibly do with these glyphs to make them actually useful to stay in the game, other than just removing them entirely and making it so that you just start off with all your rare glyphs? And I hear people who say they should just do that. I truly do. Here's my only personal problem with it. The existence of a rare glyph and the new introduction of a unique glyph means that we're definitely looking at ways for the Paragon system to evolve here. We're looking to expand on this system. And since we already have parity between the concept of like magic, rare, legendary, and unique, similarly, there are common, magic, rare, and then legendary nodes in the Paragon board. And all this is mirroring the progression of items in the game. I like to see these systems continue to have parity, continue to draw parallels, so that's very intuitive for players to get their hands on it. But I also just want them to have a value. So here are my two like wildly revolutionary concepts just to give players a tool in the early game, make progression a bit more intuitive, make the grind for Nightmare Dungeons to feel a little less harsh, and basically make the systems easier for people to get into. One, I think the glyphs should just have a radius of 5. With the induction of Tears of Blood and looking at boards and what a 5 radius glyph really looks like, you start to see some interesting options as far as pathing that exists in the game. Now, what do I mean by pathing here? Quite literally how you build through a board and how you're able to acquire power while moving from one node of interest to a different node of interest. Pathing through a board typically requires you to sacrifice some power now for power later. You're going to have to pick up your random willpower nodes on a build that doesn't care about it, so you can get over to the next dexterity or the intelligence node. But what the radius here allows you to do is continue to pick up relevant power while you are pathing to the next node of interest for whatever your build is. When I think about pathing through a board, I basically say, am I within 5 nodes of a point of interest? Either am I within 5 nodes before I begin getting investment nodes into this area right here? So just to give you an example, if this was exploit and I were to build out here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, here I'm not within 5 nodes before I can start building into the dexterity that I'm going to need. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here in the example of exploit on the bloodbath board, I am within 5 nodes. The very next node that I'm going to take is going to be of interest for the glyph that I'm building to or the path that I'm trying to travel down. And I'm never outside of 5 nodes to the next point of interest in the build itself. But you'll notice now, if I were trying to path out to another point of interest, I have to ask that question again. Can I get there within 5 nodes? In this example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I didn't make it to a gate within 5 nodes. I didn't make it to the next node of interest within 5 nodes. If I were instead pathing out this way, I could make it to my next node of interest here in this small, whatever, rare node section here. And then I can continue to build out. So maybe eventually I wrap around to a point where I either leave out of this gate as opposed to trying to lose additional nodes by traveling out of this gate. But by making these glyphs a radius 5 to start off with, we can continue to path through boards without sacrificing as many points to completely useless nodes just for pathing, and can continue to pick up additive damage bonuses. So in this example here, let's just assume that Slayer actually has a 5 node radius, like you would imagine from the Tears of Blood, and I've drawn out where all the dexterity within range for that would be. You'll notice here that I'm now only traveling 1, 2, 3, 4 nodes to be able to get to a relevant node, this dexterity right here. And on top of that, while pathing through to the next dexterity that would be within range, all of a sudden my gate being able to build out to my next glyph is only 4 points out. So I've actually saved 2 points of relevant interest by having this glyph have an expanded radius and my travel distance continuing to reward the player, as opposed to just being a net negative of lost nodes. And for people playing along at home, this means that there would be a total of 59 dexterity within range of the glyph if it were a radius 5. So how much is 59 going to get us, even at the current numbers that we're looking at here? 59 dexterity at a rate of 5 per 3.4 is going to net you 40.12 elite damage from this glyph, where we've built out to one of the rare nodes and we've continued to path through our board here. Let's say it wasn't a particularly valuable board, we just wanted to path right through it. Again, we're continuing to be rewarded for pathing further than we normally would, and we're able to get into relevant nodes sooner and get out of this board sooner as well, effectively regaining the efficiency of 2 nodes. But that's obviously not enough, right? Like, this glyph is not going to warrant building out in the way that I have just for a measly 40 elite damage here. Well, what if by hitting every node within radius on that board, you were to hit the requirement that would say half of what its contemporary glyph amongst rare glyphs would be? A very vanilla additional bonus that you'll find on a glyph is just 10% increased damage. Now, it might have some type of nuance, right? It may mean while you have no minions active, whether or not you've applied a curse, whether or not you're doing physical damage, whether or not you're doing non-physical damage. But a 10% bonus is like pretty par for the course for what a glyph would typically give you. Now, what if this glyph said by hitting the dexterity minimum requirement, you gain a 5% damage multiplier as long as you're doing damage to an elite? Or maybe wisdom just says you gain a 5% damage multiplier kind of across the board. Now it fits into a lot of different builds pretty easily. Ruin could say you gain a 5% additional critical strike damage multiplier. Overwhelm could say you gain a 5% additional overpower multiplier, etc., etc. It's pretty simple. You just apply it across the entirety of the glyph spectrum. So now we have a glyph that's going to be giving you a decent amount of additive damage, and heck, is almost certainly going to outperform any of the rare glyphs that you currently have because you haven't leveled them up yet. Since they only have a radius of 3, you're literally going to be able to hit more nodes with one of these glyphs than you would with your rare glyph. Bump up those additive damage bonuses a little bit, and now we have this multiplier as well. The multiplier is never going to outperform any of your rare glyphs because it's only ever going to be half as strong as any rare glyph's additional bonus. But you're able to put it into your board much sooner, and you're able to build into it much sooner so that people who are new to the Paragon system can kind of just fully fill out these boards with a bunch of magic glyphs. And while they may not be making the most optimized and beneficial pathing decisions that they possibly could, they're being rewarded for every point that they put in, as opposed to just pathing to some kind of more innocuous or harder to wrap your head around additional bonus you may get from a rare or a legendary node. I'm sorry, building out to Thick Hide to get additional additive damage while fortified, and then also some maximum life with a little bit of maximum life and then damage while fortified nodes here, while you're just trying to path over to Bloodbath, isn't going to feel particularly empowering. It's going to be very difficult for the character to actually see the difference that gaining this rare node may get them. But it's very easy to see how the additive damage bonus that's relevant for your build continues to go up as you continue to path through the radius of a very large glyph. The other benefit of it having a small multiplier on it is that it continues to be relevant as you inevitably transition into your rare glyphs as well. So let's say you finally get your essence glyph up to the point where it's going to have a big enough radius for you to hit the minimum requirement to get the multiplier. Now you're making this decision between, do I want to swap out this glyph here? And if I do, am I actually going to get enough benefit out of it? And if the answer is yes, it's very easy to go ahead and toss this one in. But then you get to ask the question, okay, now that I know that it's not going to have the same radius to hit these additional nodes here, should I path again? Should I re-optimize? I built in slightly interesting ways to be able to accommodate this. It's a natural instigator of getting a better understanding and learning how to traverse the Paragon system, because you see the direct decrease in power from pathing out to these potentially very interesting nodes that aren't actually within radius anymore. And then you're able to go, oh, okay, because I'm now using this glyph on this board, I need to look again at how I'm pathing. I know that this isn't going to be as efficient. So maybe this gate and this build pathway ultimately isn't going to be the best for my build. It's okay for now, But when I inevitably re-optimize, I should reinvestigate this. A very organic instigator of looking at the Paragon system under more scrutiny so that you have a better understanding of why you're making the decisions in the board that you are and how you can optimize going further. Now, I already hear the argument, Mac, that doesn't really solve the issue of these just not having value in the endgame, at least not in a way that I can kind of wrap my head around right now where it seems like it is worth its time. Well, there is where I think you might be wrong, and it kind of pulls back to the initial reason why I even looked at this system at all, which was, how can I possibly get more out of my Paragon board when it's as restricted as it is using something like the Tears of Blood? Right now, I'm looking at the Infinimus build guide that I currently have up on Maxroll, and this is the Black River Abattoir of Zir variant. Down in the variants below, if you scroll down, you'll find this information in the build guide, and you'll see that our points are very, very tight when we're currently building with just a rank 1 Tears of Blood glyph. I have just enough points for me to be able to path out in a pretty interesting way and then pick up very specifically an additional rare node down here for survivability. We also pick up an additional node over here to figure out our poison res as well as additional armor. And then right now we're being a bit gluttonous by continuing to pick up a bunch of additive damage here from these nodes that ultimately aren't going to be super valuable and will not make the cut the moment that this ranks up to a radius 5 glyph if we ever get to a rank 50 by the end of the season here. But the thing that I was looking to do is to take this investment in survivability and be able to translate it into more damage. The issue that I was running into was not being able to hit the minimum requirements of another glyph without then having to sacrifice at least some of survivability that wasn't quite comfortable giving up, most notably from this poison node or over here in the preservation node for the additional armor here. It basically meant that I was going to have to use a different elixir to be able to get the armor requirements that I wanted, unless I was willing to kind of just drop disobedience. Look, I'm not trying to bore you to death, but I was running into issues hitting a minimum requirement on a glyph that would be relevant for my build. Because most of the ones that I kind of want at this point on a pure corpse explosion build are all intelligence-based glyphs, like Exhumation is an intelligence-based glyph here. If I wanted to keep control on the board, it's an intelligence-based glyph. Darkness, intelligence, Scourge, intelligence. And the reason why intelligence is relevant here is because any glyph that uses your main stat for the character has a minimum requirement of 40 total points of investment. Whereas some of the cheekier glyphs that you can kind of fit in that aren't using your main stat only have a 25 minimum requirement. Well, let's go ahead and just revolutionize it all. Let's say that we bump up the additive damage on these magic glyphs. Let's say that they start off at a radius 5. They never get bigger, but you can continue to level them to increase the additive bonus that they give. Let's say they have a minimum requirement additional bonus that is half of the relevant multiplier. So here, again, Slayer would just give me 5% multiplicative damage against an elite. And let's say the minimum requirements for being able to hit these glyphs is only ever 15 of the relevant stat. Again, using the Tears of Blood as an example here, the minimum pathing that I would have to do out from a board where I'm already gaining some type of benefit was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points here, and then building down to the glyph and being able to hit the minimum requirement of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 total points to be able to path out of a board and into a board. Most notably, you typically need 15 points to be able to path into a board and hit a minimum requirement. Just getting into it requires you an additional 5 or 6 points to path out of the other board. So for 16 points at the end of the day here, being able to path out of a board of relevance and being able to path down to a glyph, we would end up picking up a 5% damage multiplier, as well as anywhere between 20 to 30 additional additive damage, which is actually doing a lot better, or at least comparable to some of the other glyphs that I have on this board right now. Like right now, I currently have Scourge giving me 52 additive damage and then a 10% damage multiplier. I'm currently building out to the minimum of Amplify, which is getting me 22 additive damage, a little bit of additional stats and res, and then another 10% damage multiplier. Here with Darkness only getting me 52 additive damage, and then again, another 10% damage reducer as opposed to a multiplier. But with this minimum investment, it's much easier to be able to pull out of a board in ways that aren't as valuable to you, either from smaller amounts of additive or more niche damage types, or survivability stats that you've realized you don't currently need on your build, and be able to build into just a little bit more power. In conclusion, because I said a lot of things at you, but it ultimately boils down to two things. Right here is the exact example of what I was talking about, or at least a very close example in the real game as to what you can currently do. You can currently build out to some interesting glyphs to be able to add on a 6th glyph in your entire Paragon system to be able to eke out these little additional damage bonuses that really go a long way to be able to shape up any inconsistencies or inadequacies that you currently have in your build, or just push you over the edge of being able to complete something that you couldn't previously complete. And while the magic glyphs currently exist in full obscurity, effectively not even performing the one task that is their saving grace, which is giving you an option before you find all of your glyphs, it just turns out that the progression system that currently exists in Diablo 4 doesn't actually reward you for going into Nightmare Dungeons. So you almost certainly are going to have all of your glyphs before you ever choose to go do the homework of leveling up the glyphs that you need for your build, with a lot of people hitting level 100 before they even go and level up any of their primary glyphs to rank 15. Like, really let that sink in. That is an incredibly interesting change in the dynamic of what progression looks like right now in the game versus what it looked like when it came out, and definitely what it looked like before the game came out. But what magic glyphs could be is a cool tool to be able to immediately insert into the Paragon system, so you're not losing out on a attraction. You're not feeling like you are forced to go do the Nightmare Dungeons just to go do your homework to level up the glyphs, because you already have tools at your disposal, and then it naturally incentivizes you to want to go increase the level of your rare glyphs so that you can replace your magic ones and feel that substantial increase in power. But for the players who have a little bit less time in the game, it's a really great tool to be able to organically incentivize them to learn how to pad through the Paragon board, be able to optimize in ways that are significant, teaching them what it means to swap out from one type of radius to a different one so that they can better investigate how they have pad through their board and figure out whether or not there are optimizations available for them so that they could lose out on less points, while simultaneously re-adding value to the game, and then likewise in the end game giving us new and interesting ways to consider eking out additional power benefits from being able to slot these back into a 6th, 7th, or even an 8th board, depending on how ridiculous the overlapping multipliers could be, depending on what it would look like, because of the lower requirement of total Paragon points needed to actually get to and empower these glyphs, as opposed to their contemporaries right now. But I would love to hear from you. I know a lot of people have shared a ton of opinions on how they could ultimately change these systems, what they would hope, what kind of uses they would expect to see out of these different glyphs. What do you think would be interesting ways for them to reimagine the Paragon system if and when we ultimately will get some form of overhaul for this system? As always, if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, if you like the content, I'm trying to put out this quality of content every single time I make a video. So while I may not put out a video every single day, that's just not within my wheelhouse right now, I like to hope that the videos and the quality that I put out make up for that lack of content. If you agree with me, if you don't agree with me, or at the very least you were interested in the discussion that started by this video, go ahead and leave a like on it as well, just to be able to tell YouTube, hey, there are nerds out here that like what's going on and you'd like to see more of it. And as always, I truly hope that this video helped, or at the very least entertained you. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.